They ordered me to hand her over. I'm driving into the storm.
I have been waiting for you. The link in the description will reveal everything.
I need you to step away from the terminal and put your hands where I can see them, Bronwyn said as she leaned against the heavy oak door of the archive. Her voice carried a jagged edge, like flint striking steel, and it cut through the silence of the high-altitude sanctuary. Alistair froze, his fingers hovering over the delicate vellum of a star chart that dated back 3 centuries. He did not turn immediately, his gaze lingering on the ink constellations before he slowly raised his palms. When he finally rotated his chair, the sight of her stopped his breath. She was tall, her athletic frame draped in a tattered green bodysuit and a rugged leather vest, but it was the slate-gray fur along her forearms that drew his eyes. She looked powerful yet dangerously frayed, a creature of myth standing amidst his world of paper and ink. Alistair adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the metal frames cool against his skin, as he noticed a dark, shimmering trail of blue blood smeared across the ivory stone floor. It leaked from a jagged tear in her leggings, staining the pristine surface of his life's work. "You are bleeding on the floor," he remarked, his voice surprisingly steady despite the thumping of his heart against his ribs. He stood up slowly, keeping his movements predictable so as not to spook her. The archive was a tomb of knowledge, filled with the scent of old parchment and beeswax candles, and she felt like a wildfire that had just been dragged through the front door. Bronwyn let out a harsh, barking laugh that showed a glimpse of her sharp teeth, her silver eyes scanning the endless rows of leather-bound volumes with blatant contempt. "I do not care about your dusty floor or your little maps," she spat, her tufted ears twitching toward the sound of the wind howling against the stone exterior. "I need a trauma kit and a clean blade, not a lecture on interior design." She limped further into the room, her silver gaze raking over the shelves. "Is this what you do up here? Collect dead thoughts from dead men while the rest of the world burns?" Alistair watched her, nodding the way she favored her left leg. "These books represent the collective memory of our species," he replied, moving toward a wooden cabinet marked with a red cross. "They are not dead thoughts. They are the only things that keep us from forgetting who we are." He pulled out a roll of gauze and an antiseptic wash, holding them out like an olive branch. The heavy silence was shattered by the sharp, electronic chirp of the high-frequency radio on the primary desk. Alistair hesitated, then reached for the receiver as a voice crackled through the static, cold and authoritative. "Alistair, this is Alexander," the voice announced, cutting through the mountain air with the precision of a scalpel. "We have tracked the specimen to your coordinates. Secure the perimeter and ensure she does not leave the premises. We are currently navigating the lower ridges and should be at your gates within the hour. Do not engage her, just keep her contained until the extraction team arrives. Do you understand?" Alistair looked at the radio, then at Bronwyn, who had stiffened at the sound of the name, her claws digging into the edge of a mahogany table. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He glanced at the barometer on the wall, noting the plummeting pressure and the way the shadows were deepening outside the reinforced glass windows. "Alexander is only 20 miles away," Alistair whispered, more to himself than to her. "But the blizzard is moving faster than they are. If they try to bring those heavy trucks up the eastern face, they will be buried." He turned to the window, watching the first thick flakes of snow begin to swirl in a chaotic dance. The mountain passes were already starting to vanish beneath a white shroud, and the temperature was dropping so fast that the glass began to groan under the thermal stress. "They aren't coming to rescue anyone," Bronwyn said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as she snatched the gauze from his hand. She began to wrap her wound with practiced, brutal efficiency, her silver eyes fixed on the rows of archives behind him. "You think you are protecting history," she said, her lip curling in a sneer. "But Alexander and his people didn't fund this observatory out of the goodness of their hearts. They used your data, your maps of the migratory patterns and the lunar cycles, to hunt my people down. I was a subject in their lab for 3 years because of the information stored in these very rooms. Your life's work is the blueprint for our extinction." Alistair felt a cold knot form in his stomach, his gaze drifting to the thousands of journals he had spent a decade cataloging. The thought that his quiet devotion to truth had been weaponized against a living soul made the air in the room feel thin and suffocating. He looked at Bronwyn, seeing past the sharp tongue and the defensive posture. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face and the way her hands trembled as she finished tying the bandage. She was a woman who had been hunted by the very tools he had helped sharpen. A profound conflict tore through him. This archive was his home, his sanctuary, and his only legacy. To leave it was to lose everything he had built. Yet, looking into those piercing silver eyes, he saw a spark of life that no book could ever contain. The injustice of it burned hotter than the candles on his desk. He realized that staying safe meant becoming a jailer, a role he was never meant to play. Moving with a sudden, decisive energy, Alistair crossed the room and grabbed a heavy wool coat from a brass hook. He marched to the main console and punched in a sequence of codes that echoed through the hall with the heavy thud of locking bolts. "I am locking the main observatory gates," he announced, his voice ringing with a newfound iron. "It will take Alexander's team hours to cut through the reinforced steel once they arrive." He turned to Bronwyn, who was watching him with a mixture of suspicion and growing hope. "There is a secondary maintenance road that leads through the Black Needle Pass. It is too narrow for their armored trucks and far too steep for anyone who doesn't know the terrain. If we leave now, we can make it to the valley floor before the moon reaches its zenith." Bronwyn stood up, testing her weight on her bandaged leg, her ears pinned back against her head. "You would throw all of this away for a stranger?" she asked, her voice losing its edge for the first time. "You would burn your life down just to give me a head start?" Alistair looked around the room one last time, his eyes lingering on the gold-leaf spines of the books and the polished brass of the telescope above. "It is just paper and glass," he said softly, adjusting his glasses as he grabbed a handheld flare from the emergency kit. "If I stay here and hand you over, I am just another relic in a museum. I would rather be a man who chooses his own side." He headed for the rear exit, the heavy door groaning as he pushed it open against the rising wind. The cold hit them like a physical wall, a biting, crystalline force that threatened to steal the breath from their lungs. Outside, the world had turned into a swirling void of white and gray, the jagged peaks of the mountains appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the storm. Alistair led the way to the rugged utility vehicle parked in the shed, its engine coughing to life with a mechanical roar that defied the silence of the heights. "Get in," he commanded, his voice barely audible over the screaming gale. "We have a 3-hour window before the pass becomes completely impassable, and Alexander is not the type of man to give up easily." He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he stared into the blinding curtain of snow. He was no longer the archivist. He was a pilot in a sea of ice. The mechanical growl of the rover filled the cramped garage, a sharp contrast to the muffled silence of the falling snow outside. Alistair moved with a frantic, purposeful energy, tossing heavy coils of climbing rope and a portable heater into the rear cargo bed. His fingers felt stiff, fumbling with the buckles of a survival pack, but he didn't slow down. Beside him, Bronwyn leaned against the vibrating metal of the vehicle, her breathing shallow but steady. She had found a roll of silk mapping fabric in a nearby drawer and was now winding it tightly around her forearm, the delicate material soaking up the vivid blue of her blood. Her silver eyes tracked Alistair's every movement, watching the way his shadow stretched long and thin against the stone walls. She didn't offer to help. She simply measured him, her tufted ears twitching as she listened for the sounds of the mountains shifting under the weight of the gathering ice. The silence was punctured by the sudden, piercing shriek of the radio on the garage workbench. Alexander's voice returned, stripped of its previous patience and replaced with a slick, transactional tone. "Alistair, listen to me very carefully," the man said, the signal remarkably clear despite the interference. "I know you have a soft heart for the preservation of things, so let us talk about your future. If you keep that door locked and hold her there for just 2 more hours, I will personally see to it that you are appointed chief curator at the Capital Academy. You will have every resource, every rare manuscript, and a salary that will make this frozen rock a distant memory. Don't throw away a decade of scholarship for a creature that doesn't even have a name in our census." He paused, the sound of a heavy engine idling in the background of his transmission. "Just sit tight, and your life begins today." Alistair stood frozen by the driver's side door, his hand hovering over the handle. The lure of the Capital Academy was a dream he had nursed through 1,000 lonely nights, a promise of warmth and recognition that felt almost tangible. Bronwyn watched him, her expression unreadable, though her lip curled slightly to reveal a sharp, ivory fang. "You should take it," she said, her voice a low rasp that vibrated in the small space. "Look at me, Alistair. I am a nightmare wrapped in fur and scars. I am the thing that makes people lock their windows at night. If you choose me over those books, you are choosing a ghost over a legacy." She shifted her weight, the leather of her vest creaking. "I won't hate you for it. I expect people to choose the gold over the monster. It is the only way the world has ever worked for me." Her words acted like a spark in a dry forest. Alistair looked at the radio, then at the shelves of priceless astronomical catalogs visible through the open door to the main hall. He thought of the centuries of observation, the meticulous ink drawings of constellations, and the quiet dignity of the men who had recorded them. Then he looked at Bronwyn, a living, breathing person who was being reduced to a specimen by men who valued data over pulse. Without a word, he reached for a heavy brass kerosene lantern hanging from a peg. He turned the wick up until the flame roared. Then he swung his arm with a violent, desperate strength. The lantern shattered against the bottom shelf of the primary archive, the glass spraying like diamonds as the fuel ignited. The dry parchment caught instantly, a wall of orange flame leaping toward the ceiling, consuming the history he had spent his life protecting. The heat was an immediate physical presence, pushing back the chill of the garage. Bronwyn's eyes widened, the silver reflecting the dancing fire as the archive began to roar with the hunger of the blaze. "Why did you do that?" she hissed, her voice thick with genuine shock. Alistair didn't look back at the burning room. "Their thermal sensors will be blinded by the heat signature of the fire," he explained, his voice trembling but certain as he climbed into the driver's seat. "They won't be able to track the rover's exhaust through the mountain passes if the entire peak is glowing on their monitors." He slammed the door shut and engaged the heavy gears. "I didn't just burn the books, Bronwyn. I burned the map they were using to find you. Now get in before the smoke chokes us both." They lurched out of the garage and into the white maw of the storm. The wind slammed into the reinforced glass of the rover with the force of a physical blow, a screaming wall of ice that reduced visibility to a few flickering feet. The wipers struggled against the heavy accumulation, groaning under the strain as Alistair navigated the narrow, crumbling ledge of the maintenance road. Every gust threatened to shove the vehicle off the precipice into the dark abyss below. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of singed wool and the metallic tang of Bronwyn's blood. The rover bounced violently over a hidden rock, and Alistair gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned the color of the snow outside. He felt the mountain breathing against them, a cold, indifferent giant that didn't care about their escape or their survival. As they crawled higher into the frozen heights, the immediate adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy, shivering exhaustion. To keep himself focused, Alistair glanced at the jagged mark on Bronwyn's muzzle. "How did you get it?" he asked, his voice a tether to reality in the swirling white. Bronwyn touched the scar with a furred finger, her gaze fixed on the dashboard. "A silver-tipped spear," she replied quietly. "There was a younger cub in my pack who couldn't run fast enough when the collectors came. I stood between him and the line. I thought if I looked fierce enough, they would hesitate." She let out a dry, hollow laugh. "They didn't hesitate. They just aimed higher. But he got away. That is the only reason I don't regret the mark." It reminded her of a time when she wasn't just a fugitive but a protector, and the memory seemed to settle some of the jagged tension in her shoulders. Suddenly, the rover's center console flickered and died, the digital GPS screen turning into a useless slab of dark glass. The atmospheric interference from the storm had finally severed their connection to the satellite grid. "We're blind," Alistair muttered, his heart hammering against his ribs as he slowed the vehicle to a crawl. "I can't see the markers and the road is gone." Bronwyn looked up, her tufted ears swiveling toward the roof. "The moon is behind those clouds, but the stars are still there," she said, pointing toward the sunroof. "You told me those books were about the stars. Prove it." Alistair looked up, wiped the condensation from the glass, and saw a faint, shimmering cluster through a momentary break in the clouds. He recognized the alignment of the hunter's belt, a celestial compass he had mapped 1,000 times. He took a breath, ignored the dead electronics, and steered the rover by the ancient light of the stars above. The tires shrieked as they lost their grip on a hidden shelf of black ice, sending the heavy rover into a sickening lateral slide. Alistair slammed his boots against the floorboards, his breath hitching as the vehicle tilted toward the jagged lip of a 1,000-foot drop. The headlights cut uselessly into the swirling white abyss, illuminating nothing but falling crystals and the terrifying absence of solid ground. Before he could even find the brake, Bronwyn lunged across the center console, her powerful, fur-dusted arms reaching through the open window. She didn't hesitate, her claws digging into the freezing metal of the exterior winch housing with a strength that defied her injuries. With a guttural snarl of exertion, she looped the heavy steel cable around a protruding spur of granite just as the rear tire slipped into empty space. The rover jerked to a violent halt, dangling over the precipice like a pendulum until the winch groaned and began to haul them back onto the narrow path. Alistair sat paralyzed, his chest heaving, watching the silver-furred muscles of her back ripple under the strain of the rescue. Once the vehicle was stabilized on a wider stretch of the ridge, they sought refuge in a secondary sensor hut, a squat concrete bunker half buried in the drifts. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of dry batteries and cold copper. Alistair fumbled with a small portable stove, his hands shaking so violently that the matches kept snapping. He looked around the cramped space, his eyes landing on a rusted transit tool in the corner. "I have lived on this peak since I was 12 years old," he admitted, his voice cracking in the hollow room. "My father was the apprentice here before me, and his father before that. I have never seen the lights of the valley cities or stood on a shore where the water doesn't freeze. This mountain is my entire map of the universe." He looked at Bronwyn, who was crouched near the door, her ears swiveling to catch the moan of the wind. To him, the world was a collection of ink and paper, a static reality that was now being shredded by the chaos of her arrival. A sudden burst of static erupted from a wall-mounted emergency receiver, startling them both. A woman's voice, sharp and laced with a familiar authority, cut through the white noise. "Alistair, it is Catherine," the speaker crackled, the signal flickering like a dying candle. "I am patching this through a private relay from the lower station. You need to move now. Alexander has authorized the launch of 3 tactical aerial drones with thermal imaging. They are bypassing the main roads and scanning the vertical faces of the cliffs. If they catch your heat signature, they will lock on and guide the ground team directly to your throat." Alistair felt a cold sweat break out across his neck at the mention of his former mentor. Catherine had taught him how to read the clouds, but now she was teaching him how to hide from a predator. He thanked her with a quick tap on the transmitter, but the line had already gone dead, leaving them in a silence that felt heavier than before. The atmosphere inside the hut shifted as the moon reached its zenith behind the thick blanket of clouds. Bronwyn suddenly slumped against the concrete wall, a low moan escaping her throat that sounded more like a growl than a human cry. Her tufted ears twitched violently, and Alistair watched in a mixture of awe and terror as the slate-gray fur along her forearms began to thicken and darken. The bones in her hands made a soft, wet clicking sound as they lengthened, her fingernails sharpening into obsidian points. "It is the peak," she gasped, her silver eyes blown wide with a primal agony. "The moon calls to the marrow, and I cannot quiet the response." Even as she fought the transformation, her head snapped toward the ceiling. "I hear them," she whispered, her voice layered with a strange, resonant vibration. "Rotors, cutting through the wind. They are coming from the north." Alistair knew they couldn't outrun the drones on the open road, but he remembered the geological surveys he had spent years digitizing. "We need to go underground," he said, grabbing his pack and helping Bronwyn to her feet. "The veins of this mountain are rich in magnetite and heavy iron deposits. There is a limestone cave system less than a mile from here that is thick with mineral shielding. If we get deep enough, their sensors will bounce off the walls like echoes in a canyon." He led her out into the biting gale, using his body to shield her from the worst of the spray. He moved with a newfound desperation, his mind visualizing the subterranean maps he had once found boring. They scrambled over a field of jagged scree, the sound of the approaching drone engines growing into a high-pitched whine that vibrated in their very teeth. They tumbled into the mouth of the cavern just as a searchlight swept over the snow where they had stood seconds before. The interior was a cathedral of shadow, dripping with moisture and smelling of ancient earth. Alistair clicked on a small flashlight, but the beam danced erratically in his trembling grip. Bronwyn leaned against a stalagmite, her breathing heavy as she watched his hands shake. "You are a strange little man, Alistair," she mocked, though there was a new softness behind her sharp tongue. "You burned your life's work, you drove a truck off a cliff, and you're facing down a private army. Yet you look like you're about to faint because the lights went out." Alistair took a jagged breath, his back against the cold stone. "I am terrified of the dark," he confessed, his voice a tiny thread in the vast cavern. "I always have been. That is why I became an archivist. I wanted to be surrounded by lamps and certainty, but I am not going to stop moving until you are safe." As they pushed deeper into the winding tunnels, the flashlight beam caught a flash of unnatural symmetry on a flat section of the cave wall. Alistair stepped closer, his heart skipping a beat as he wiped away a layer of damp moss. Carved into the stone was a circular emblem of a stylized sun rising over a valley, surrounded by a ring of ancient runes. "This matches the frontispiece of the Book of Arrivals," he whispered, his fingers tracing the cold indentations. "I thought it was just a decorative flourish by a bored monk in the 14th century. He realized then that the safe haven Bronwyn sought wasn't a myth or a ghost story passed down by her kind. It was a physical destination, a hidden geographic reality that had been recorded by his predecessors, and hidden in plain sight within the archives he had protected his whole life. The weight of the realization hit him with the force of a landslide. His archives hadn't just been a collection of dusty history and astronomical data. They were a coded map to the very freedom Bronwyn had been seeking since she was a child. Every star chart he had memorized, and every terrain map he had filed away, were pieces of a puzzle that led to this exact cavern system. He wasn't just a librarian who had lost his home. He was the navigator she had been destined to find. "We aren't just hiding, Bronwyn," he said, turning to her with a sudden, fierce clarity in his eyes. "We are on the right path. The valley is real, and the way through the mountain is written in the stars I've been watching every night of my life." He reached out and took her furred hand, his grip finally steady as he led her further into the dark. The jagged mouth of the cavern offered a brief reprieve from the wind, but the safety was an illusion. As they stepped onto the final ledge of the cave exit, a high-pitched whine signaled the arrival of the mechanical hunters. A sleek, black drone dipped from the clouds like a bird of prey, its gimbaled lens locking onto the metallic sheen of the rover parked nearby. Before Alistair could even shout a warning, a concentrated pulse of energy lanced through the air, striking the vehicle's front axle with surgical precision. The engine block erupted in a shower of sparks and acrid smoke, the heavy frame groaning as it settled into the frozen mud. Alistair felt a sickening lurch in his chest. Their only means of speed was now a charred skeleton of steel. "We have to move," he urged, grabbing his pack and looking at the steep, winding path that remained. The machines had found them, and the mountain was no longer a hiding place but a cage. The roar of a secondary engine drowned out the whistling gale as a light scout craft descended from the heavy overcast, its landing struts extending like the legs of an insect. It touched down on a granite ridge 30 yards above them, the downdraft sending a spray of ice crystals into Alistair's face. A loudspeaker crackled to life, the voice of Alexander amplified and distorted by the mountain's echoes. "Alistair, stand down immediately," the man commanded, his tone dripping with a cold, calculated paternalism. "You are an academic, not a fugitive. Step away from the specimen and I will guarantee a full pardon for your recent lapses in judgment. Your career is still salvageable if you act now." Alistair looked up at the silhouette of the craft, his jaw tightening. He thought of his quiet life among the scrolls, the safety he was being offered, and then he looked at the woman beside him. The choice felt like ash in his mouth, but his feet did not move toward the ridge. The temperature plummeted as the sky turned a bruised purple, the true bite of the high-altitude winter beginning to gnaw at their bones. Bronwyn let out a low, rhythmic huff, her body reacting to the lethal chill in a way that defied human biology. Alistair watched, fascinated despite the danger, as her slate-gray fur surged with new growth, becoming a thick, insulating mantle that covered her shoulders and spine. Her posture shifted, her center of gravity dropping as she moved with a predatory grace that seemed to ignore the slick ice beneath her boots. She stepped in front of Alistair, her bulk creating a physical barrier against the scouting craft's spotlight. "I will not let them touch you," she rumbled, her voice now a deep vibration that felt like tectonic plates grinding together. She looked like a creature of ancient myth, a guardian of the peaks standing defiant against the polished technology of the men who wanted to own her. The scout craft's night vision sensors began to pivot, scanning the ledge for a clear shot at Bronwyn's legs. Alistair fumbled with the side pocket of his rucksack, his fingers numb as he pulled out a high-intensity emergency flare. He struck the cap against the ignition strip, and a violent, blinding crimson light hissed into existence, casting long, dancing shadows against the cliff face. The sudden brilliance washed out the scout craft's delicate optics, the pilot veering the sensors away from the overwhelming glare. "Go now," Alistair yelled over the roar of the wind. Bronwyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed the back of his heavy wool coat and pulled him toward the narrowest part of the ledge. She wasn't looking at the path with her eyes anymore. Her muzzle was tilted up, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the valley floor hidden beneath the frost. She navigated by the smell of pine and damp earth, leading him through a labyrinth of stone that no map could have charted. They emerged from the jagged rocks to face the Bridge of Sighs, a natural stone arch that spanned a terrifying gap between two towering massifs. It was the final gateway, a precarious ribbon of granite that looked as fragile as a thread in the churning mist. But the path was blocked. 3 figures in tactical gear stood at the center of the span, their weapons raised and their visors glowing with a faint blue light. Alexander's extraction team had anticipated the route. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs as he realized they were cornered between the abyss and the barrels of high-powered rifles. The wind howled through the archway, a mournful sound that gave the bridge its name, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze in a standoff of steel and fur. Movement on the far side of the chasm caught Alistair's eye. A lone figure stepped out from behind a cluster of frozen boulders, wrapped in a heavy, fur-lined parka that Alistair recognized instantly. Catherine held a flare of her own, but hers was green, a signal of distress and defiance. "Stand down, Alexander," she shouted, her voice carrying across the gap with surprising strength. "This sector is no longer under your jurisdiction. I have spent 20 years ensuring this valley remained a sanctuary, and I will not let you turn it into a laboratory." Alistair realized then that his mentor's warnings hadn't just been out of concern for him. She was the silent warden of the very place they were trying to reach. She had been the one erasing the records and misdirecting the surveys for decades, protecting the secret that Bronwyn carried in her blood. The standoff shattered when Alexander, watching from the ridge above, gave a sharp command over the radio. A warning shot from the scout craft's mounted cannon struck the base of the stone arch, the impact vibrating through the very soles of Alistair's boots. The stone groaned, a web of cracks spreading rapidly through the ancient granite. With a sickening crack, the section of the bridge beneath Alistair's feet gave way. He felt the stomach-turning sensation of weightlessness as the ledge vanished, his hands clawing at the air. He managed to snag a jagged outcropping of rock, but his boots dangled over a misty void that seemed to have no bottom. The archive, the books, the safety of his old life, it all felt like a dream as he hung by his fingertips, the cold stone biting into his skin like a predator's teeth. Bronwyn was already halfway across the stable portion of the bridge, her powerful legs coiled to leap the gap to where Catherine stood waiting. She could have made it. The distance was well within her preternatural reach, and safety was a single bound away. Instead, she spun around, her silver eyes locking onto Alistair's terrified face. She ignored the shouts of the soldiers and the whine of the approaching drones. Dropping to her knees, she lunged toward the crumbling edge, her furred hand shooting out to catch Alistair's wrist just as his grip began to fail. Her strength was immense. The muscles in her arm corded like steel cables as she anchored herself against the shifting stone. "You are not falling today, librarian," she snarled, her teeth bared in a grimace of absolute effort. She chose the weight of his life over the ease of her own escape, pulling him upward even as the bridge continued to disintegrate beneath them. Alistair scrambled for purchase on the trembling rock, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As Bronwyn hauled him onto the solid shoulder of the mountain, he didn't stop to catch his breath. His eyes darted to a rusted iron lever protruding from a frost-covered housing near the cavern's mouth. This was the mechanism he had read about in the journals of the first surveyors, a desperate defense designed to trigger a controlled collapse of the upper scree. He lunged for the handle, his frozen fingers fumbling with the locking pin. Alexander's scout craft hovered above, its spotlight searching for them through the whiteout. With a guttural shout, Alistair threw his entire weight against the lever. The metal shrieked as it gave way, the sound echoing like a dying giant. Deep within the mountain's throat, a series of counterweights dropped, and the very foundation of the peak began to shudder with a rhythmic, terrifying force. The mountain itself seemed to wake up and reject the invaders. Above the bridge, a massive shelf of blue ice and jagged granite lost its grip on the slope. It started as a low rumble that Alistair felt in his teeth, then escalated into a deafening roar that swallowed the whine of the drones. A wall of white and gray cascaded down the vertical face, a tidal wave of stone that obliterated the path behind them. Alexander's craft veered sharply, the pilot forced to bank away as the air became thick with debris and crushing pressure. The paramilitary team on the far ridge vanished behind a curtain of falling mountain, their tactical lights snuffed out by the sheer volume of the slide. The world turned into a chaotic blur of motion and noise, but the bridge's anchor held just long enough for them to scramble into the lee of a massive boulder. The aftermath was a suffocating silence, broken only by the thin whistle of the wind over the new landscape. Alistair tried to stand, but his legs were like water, and the cold had finally begun to seep past his thermal layers into his marrow. His vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting as the adrenaline ebbed away. Bronwyn was there instantly, her slate-gray fur matted with ice but her body radiating a furnace-like heat. She didn't ask for permission. She scooped him up, cradling him against her chest where the steady thrum of her heart acted as a metronome for his own fading pulse. She began to run, her powerful strides eating up the remaining distance of the high pass. Every time he felt his eyes closing, she would nudge his cheek with her muzzle, her breath a warm cloud in the freezing air. Just as the first sliver of gold cracked the eastern horizon, they crested the final ridge. The descent was a plunge into a different world entirely. As they moved down the southern face, the biting wind died away, replaced by a strange, humid warmth that smelled of sulfur and wet moss. They emerged into a wide, bowl-shaped valley where the ground was carpeted in vibrant emerald grass that stayed green even in the dead of winter. Steam rose from bubbling geothermal pools, weaving through groves of ancient, twisted trees. High above, despite the growing light of the morning, the northern lights continued to ripple in curtains of violet and lime, fueled by some strange magnetic anomaly in the valley floor. It was a pocket of impossible life tucked away from the world's prying eyes. Bronwyn set him down gently on a bed of soft clover, her ears twitching as she scanned the tree line for any lingering threats. A familiar silhouette stepped out from the mist of a nearby hot spring. Catherine approached them, her parka hood pushed back to reveal a face lined with relief. She held a ceramic flask that smelled of bitter herbs and honey, handing it to Alistair before placing a steadying hand on Bronwyn's shoulder. "You made it further than I dared hope," Catherine said, her voice soft and resonant in the quiet valley. She looked at Alistair with a pride that made his chest ache. "This place has needed a keeper who understands the language of the sky. The pack uses the stars to know when the seasons are shifting, but they have lost the old ways of reading the deep constellations. Your archives might be ash, Alistair, but the maps you carry in your head are the most valuable things in this sanctuary. You aren't a guest here. You are the navigator we have been waiting for." As the sun rose higher, the primal tension in Bronwyn's frame began to dissolve. The thick mantle of gray fur receded, her elongated limbs shortening and her features softening back into the sharp, clever lines of the woman Alistair had first met in the archives. She stood before him in her tactical vest, looking weary but more whole than he had ever seen her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand with a touch that was no longer a challenge or a defense. It was a gesture of profound, quiet gratitude. "Thank you for not being the man they wanted you to be," she whispered, her silver eyes reflecting the dancing lights above. Her wit was gone, replaced by a sincerity that felt more intimate than any words they had shared during the flight. She didn't pull away when he closed his hand over hers, their fingers interlacing in the warm valley air. Alistair looked back at the towering peaks they had crossed, the jagged silhouettes now golden in the full light of day. For years, he had lived through the stories of others, hiding behind the vellum pages of dead explorers and the cold data of distant stars. He had thought that losing his books meant losing himself, but as he stood in the grass with the damp earth beneath his boots, he realized the truth. He was no longer an observer of history. He was the ink on the page, a living part of a story that was still being written. The archives were gone, but the knowledge had been forged into something stronger through fire and ice. He wasn't just Alistair the archivist anymore. He was the man who had driven into the storm and come out the other side with a purpose that no academy could ever grant him. They stood together on the edge of a steaming pool, watching the sun fully claim the sky. The northern lights faded into the brilliant blue of a clear mountain morning, leaving behind a sense of peace that Alistair had never known in the sterile halls of his old life. There would be no more orders from men like Alexander, no more hiding in the shadows of a lonely observatory. The valley was a fortress of a different kind, protected by the mountain and the people who called it home. Bronwyn leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence a solid, grounding weight that promised he would never have to face the cold alone again. Together, they turned away from the peaks and walked toward the center of the valley, stepping into a future that belonged to them and the stars they would watch together.